Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable, philosophical discussions, as well as helping you, the listener, develop and reason through your views. In this episode, I speak to philosopher Michael Huemer. We speak on his book, Ethical Intuitionism. Ethical Intuitionism is a meta-ethical position within moral philosophy. If you find value in this content, please consider rating, sharing, reviewing, and following the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I bring you Dr. Michael Huemer. Okay, so Professor Huemer, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah. So before we get started, can you kind of tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm a professor in the philosophy department at the University of Colorado, where I've been for over 20 years, I guess. I went to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate, and then I went to Rutgers University as a graduate student for PhD in philosophy. At the time, Rutgers was the number 3 ranked philosophy department in the country, and they subsequently moved up to number 2.
All right, very
So,
cool.
so I've
Oh,
written a
go
bunch
ahead.
of articles, like 70 articles and like 6 books or something like that.
Okay, and what would you say like your best known work is for? Because I know you have one on political authority and ethical vegetarianism.
Yes. My most popular book is The Problem of Political Authority, which is basically about why the government doesn't have any authority. Libertarians love it. And
Yeah.
so I think I've sold a lot of copies to libertarians. Even non-libertarians sometimes like it.
Okay. Yeah. It's something of
Really good.
it's one of the books it's on my queue for Amazon, so I've yet to buy that one for myself. So I guess one question I have is why philosophy? How'd you get into it? Is it something you always kind of yearn for? So
Well, I guess I was thinking about philosophy before I knew what philosophy was. Wondered philosophical questions when I didn't know that there was a subject matter where you study those things. And
yeah,
when I was in all of school up until college, I noticed that we were never allowed to discuss anything interesting or anything that mattered, right? And uh,
yeah,
and there are 2 parts of that, right? Discuss and interesting. Right. So there were classes in which you had discussion, but you were not allowed to talk about the obviously interesting and important issues, right? So, like, you have an English class and you talk about some great work of literature, which is about a philosophical theme, but you're not allowed to directly address the philosophical issue, right? So, like, you read Waiting for Godot, like we read in 12th grade, but you're not supposed to talk about the existence of God, right? Which some people think that that play was about. Okay, you read Crime and Punishment, but you're not allowed to talk about the justification of punishment or the nature of crime or whatever.
mhm,
So I found that very annoying. And then there are other classes in which you learn things that are important, but you do not discuss them. So you take a science class, and they will like teach you the laws of nature, but they will not discuss, what the laws of nature are. They will just say, "This is what's known. Learn it," right? And
yeah.
so then, when I got to college, I took a philosophy class, and that was the first time that you're allowed to actually talk about things that matter, where like the teacher would invite you to explore the actual issue using your own mind, right?
Yeah.
Not just like give back what they taught you, right? But
Mhm.
to think about it yourself.
And to actually engage. No, I totally agree. At least within my education, it's the same thing to where, I mean, like just simple subjects of English, like philosophy of language, it's just you're taught these are kind of the rules, but it's like, okay, well, why are we following these rules? What does it mean to even make a statement or a proposition? So, no, I'm
Yeah.
totally with you on that. And even in my graduate, so I'm currently a graduate student and for applied behavior analysis, and just some of the philosophy work. So everything that I'm learning is after the fact. So it's like, okay, here's all the philosophical groundwork, and it kind of was just it's very brushed over. And then now it's like, okay, here's the principles. These are the principles that we're operating on. Of, but it's just kind of like, well, hold on one second. Like
Yeah.
it's very, for example, I find it very interesting to where it's very empirically based and everything has to be verified. But then I think, okay, well, there are certain values that may not, I don't think, are verifiable in that way that you're wanting, but yet we're predicated on that, and it just seems a little self-defeating in that way. But that's one of my problems I have with behavior analysis. Anyway, but
Can see how
anyway,
that would happen. Yeah.
so let's move on to our main topic, which is ethical intuitionism. So I found this book from my philosophy professor that I had that I still keep in touch with, and he recommended this book. So I'm like, okay, I'll check it out and see what's it about, because I've never heard of ethical intuitionism. My background has always kind of been um, so I grew up in a Christian home, so it's kind of like, okay, well, God is kind of that moral foundation, and if it's not, and if God isn't that moral foundation, then everything is just subjective or relative. That's kind of like the idea that was always pushed. And so I felt when I kind of went away from the church and no longer a Christian, or identify as a Christian, it's kind of like, okay, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's subjective, all right. It's off of my own opinion. It is what I think is right. But then there's still kind of this problem that you end up having when at least the problems with subjectivism. And so the more I've learned and the more I've studied, it's like, okay, there actually are legitimate answers to an objective basis for morality or ethics that is non-theistic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so commenting on the um, theistic basis for morality, I mean, I think it's kind of confused. I think basically the people who think that God is the basis of morality are, in fact, subjectivists or skeptics or something. They don't know that that's what they are, but it is because nobody says that about things that really are objective, that everybody knows are objective, right? So like nobody says, oh, if you don't have God, then how can the physical world exist? How could you believe that physics is objective? Nobody says that because everyone knows that it is actually objective, right? And being actually objective means that it doesn't depend upon some person, right? It doesn't depend upon an observer who has whatever attitudes or desires or something. Um, so, yeah, the thought that it couldn't be objective without there being like a big, powerful being who's telling it to you is the thought that it's subjective. That's what they mean, right?
Yeah. And what's interesting, because when I read this in your book on subjectivism, and uh, when I read that section with God, I'm like, wait, I've never. You're normally it's just kind of what's the word? Kind of just ingrained in you a little bit to where it's like, okay, well, if they're outside of human preference or mental state, brain state, whatever the cause, there has to be this foundation to which we rely upon, and that thing that we rely upon is God, because God is that foundation. And so when I read that it's subjective, I sat there and I thought a second. I was like, you know what? That like I never thought about it that way, to where it's like, well, it's all contingent upon, or at least on God's mental states or His preferences, and that too is subjective. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. And, like, I mean, you can think about other things like mathematics, right? I assume mathematics is objective. And, I don't hear anybody saying, oh, it has to be based on God in order to be objective, right? Like, if you
mhm.
think, if you think that God makes up the mathematical facts, then you're an anti-realist, right?
Yeah,
Um, anyway, so when people ask, "Oh, what's the basis for morality?" Well, I'm not sure that there's a basis exactly. Like, what if somebody asks, "What's the basis for mathematics?" Um, okay, I'm not like not even sure what that is asking or what the answer is. Like, you can ask what the theorems of mathematics are based on, which is they're based on the axioms. If somebody asks, "What are the axioms based on?" I don't know. Like they're nothing. They're not based on anything, right?
yeah,
And similarly about ethics, right?
yeah, and it seems as if that's what people are, at least in the circles that I've been in, and from what I hear from Christian apologists, like someone like William Lane Craig, will say something on the lines of that. Well, without this foundation, for whatever reason, they're wanting this reference point. So, like like just to let me see, like what's something that they would say, or something that I can hear, like so like what, like the length of a wall. Okay, well, how do we measure it? Well, it's in reference to like a ruler, and so we're referencing this measurement off of this thing that we've created, which is the ruler. And so I would, and kind of analogous would be, well, when we call something good, it's in reference to something else.
Yeah.
And so that's what I see them doing. And so yeah, what are your thoughts kind of on that? That's why
Uh,
it seems as if that's why there's this standard that they need, or it seems as if people are wanting.
right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, how do we say how long something is? Okay, we put a ruler there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the what is the basis for the length of the ruler?
Yeah.
Like, what if someone asks you? Is it that there's another ruler? No, right? It just has a certain length by itself, right?
Yeah.
So, like, there's an arbitrary convention that we call that length 1 foot. Okay,
Hmm.
that's conventional. That's dependent on us.
Yeah.
But the fact that the object has that length is not conventional.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I don't understand this thing about but by the way, like, I think that that's something special about measurement. Like, you measure things by reference to a standard,
Hmm.
but that's not like an observation about the nature of properties.
Okay.
Like, so it might be that the only way you can tell somebody how long something is by comparing it to something else that they're familiar with. Like, they've already seen the length of that other thing.
Hmm.
But it's not the case that the property itself only exists in comparison, right? It's like if all the rulers in the world get destroyed, everything will not suddenly lose its length and like, have no length, right?
Right. No, true. Okay, interesting. All right, so let's talk about ethical intuitionism. So this is a meta ethic view, if I'm not correct, and it's kind of predicated on what you call phenomenal conservatism as like kind of like the basis groundwork of kind of getting it off the table. Is that is that accurate? Would you say or?
Yeah. So yeah, like what I call phenomenal conservatism, that's a term that I made up in 2001.
Hmm.
It refers to basically the idea that um, it's rational to assume that things are the way that they seem to be, unless you have reason for doubting that. Right. So, in other words, I don't have to give an argument that what appears to be the case is the case. I assume that things are as they appear to be, unless somebody gives me an argument that they're not. Right. Okay. So then, like the burden of proof gets shifted onto the skeptic. So, um,
So, kind of like to flesh it out. So, like if phenomenal conservatism would say, if I, under normal factors, I'm not hallucinating, my brain states are properly functioning. I walk into the room and I see kind of a cup on the table. I am kind of what you would say, like prima facie justified in believing that there actually is a cup on the table in the absence of those defeaters.
yeah. Right. Yeah. So, like, oh, it looks like there's a coffee mug. Oh, wait, it's disappeared. Looks
Like,
like there's a coffee mug here or
yeah,
whatever. So that's probably what it is,
yeah,
unless you have a reason for doubting that. So I'm not saying that you always believe that it's what it appears. I'm saying until you have a reason for thinking otherwise, right? So that's true about observation by the five senses. Like, you see something, you assume that it is what it looks like, unless you have reason to think otherwise. But it's also true about all other forms of cognition. So, um, like I seem to remember that I had a piece of toast this morning,
hmm,
and so I think that that's what happened, unless I have a reason for doubting it.
right.
Like, as long as I don't have a reason for thinking my memory is defective or whatever.
Okay.
Right.
So how it applies to something, let's say, like in a moral situation, if you see someone, like for example, just intellectually thinking about, torturing children for fun, that just kind of just having this exercise it appears like that's just wrong. And would you say that's kind of before any argument that's given, it's just that it appears to be that way. So I am at least in this sense justified in believing that it actually is the case that um,
Right.
uh,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Right. So, like I'm saying, this phenomenal conservatism applies to all forms of human cognition. And one form of cognition is what we call intuition.
mhm,
And by the way, what philosophers mean by intuition is it's kind of a technical term. It's not the sort of ordinary English usage. Okay. That so what we're talking about is you think about something intellectually and it seems a certain way. So, you think about torturing children for fun. Does that seem right or does that seem wrong? And like if you're a normal person,
yeah,
you answer that seems wrong, right? Like, it very clearly seems wrong. This does not seem like this is not a difficult case or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so, unless I have reason to think otherwise, it's wrong.
And so does that kind of I guess there is some more groundwork that you kind of have within your book, Ethical Intuitionism, to where when I think about so that's I'm thinking of like a possible pushback to kind of this the statement. So when I think about it appears that um, torturing babies for fun is wrong. In your mind, or from what you would argue, you're saying that's a I am stating a cognitive like a cognitive statement. It's that there's truth apt to it, as opposed to a non-cognitivist. Someone would say like, well, actually, it's not really a belief statement. You're just kind of it's some utterance that's predicated on your emotion or your kind of mental state.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So some people think the emotivists think that when you make these moral statements, you're just expressing your feelings about something. Like you and I have a negative emotion about baby torture, and we're just expressing that when we say torturing babies is wrong. And importantly, um, this is it's said to be a non-propositional. Like we're not asserting that the world is a certain way,
mhm.
just expressing how you feel. So that's neither true nor false, right? Like ouch is neither true nor false. Okay, it's like that, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that's what the non-cognitivists say, including AJ Ayer. Um, and what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this is just that all of the evidence is against it. Right? That is, um, you can look at the way normal cognitive statements work in language. Like when you um, utter a sentence that expresses a proposition, and you can compare that to other cases where you utter a sentence that everybody knows doesn't express a proposition. Okay, so like it's raining, that expresses a proposition.
Mhm.
Shut the door, that does not express a proposition. Okay, and then there are like linguistic tests that distinguish these from each other, right? So, for example, you can put the proposition in the antecedent of a conditional, and you can say, if it's raining, then something else.
Mhm.
You cannot put the non-cognitive statement in the antecedent. So you can't say, if please pass the salt, then something else, right? Or if what time is it, then,
Okay.
right? Or if out, then, etc. Okay. So
Yeah.
like the non-cognitive utterances don't go there, right? And
Mhm.
then there's just like a series of things that are like that, right? A series of tests that you can apply to statements or to sentences that, infallibly, if you leave aside the case of moral statements.
Mhm.
They separate cognitive from non-cognitive, or propositional from non-propositional statements. And all of those tests give the same result when applied to moral statements, namely that they express proposition. They act exactly like the proposition expressed in sentences.
Okay. So I think so if I'm understanding you right, it seems as if when you put something like that in like a syllogistic form, so like a if P then Q kind of way, it becomes, I guess, in this sense, the like what my mind goes to is like it just becomes incoherent at that point to say like it doesn't make sense to say if boo then shut the I mean
Yeah,
then something else. Like it doesn't make sense to say something like that, or it's literally incoherent to utter that kind of
yeah,
statement. But it
yeah.
seems as if there's also an equivocation at the same time too. I think to where like if you're saying I'm trying to think of like like what an emotivist might say like if I say if murder is wrong, what I'm really saying is murder is boo or something like
Boo on murder.
yeah boo on murder something like that. And then the next statement is I think you have this kind of lined out in your book. If it's wrong to murder, then telling Bobby to murder is wrong.
Yeah,
And it seems as if like when you put those two in that syllogistic form, it becomes an equivocation on what you're saying in the sense of like one's a normative expression and the other one is a like a proposition. Am I not following that
well,
or
yeah, okay. Actually, so I mean, the original example from Peter Geach is something like, if doing something is wrong, then getting your little brother to do it is wrong.
hmm
So that seems right. And by the way, that makes sense, right?
hmm
Um, which is the important thing, right? Now, suppose that you think the word wrong doesn't refer to any property and it's just used to express your emotions. Then what does the sentence mean? Like what? So if doing something is wrong, okay, and now what negative emotion is somebody expressing?
Hmm.
Like towards what? Are they expressing a negative emotion towards doing something? No, right?
Hmm.
And then like if negative emotion, then another negative emotion. Well, that doesn't make sense either, right?
And so this is kind of like the beginning of like the problem, I guess, in a like a non-cognitivist has trouble making sense of these kind of propositions or these
Right.
statements. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, okay, so after this, after you kind of laid the groundwork of like this phenomenal conservatism, so just to kind of recap, these are kind of intellectual appearances. Where do you go from there once you start um, having these? So, okay, let's just we grant that we have these intuitions. Is this is this a I don't know if it has to be reliable, but is this a way to actually kind of figure out if what my intuition is corresponding to something in reality?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you might say, oh, okay, how do we know that intuition is reliable? Okay. Well, I mean, suppose you think that in order to know something intuitively, you have to first verify that intuition is reliable independently. Okay, if you're allowed to use intuition, then it's going to be easy. But if you have to verify without using intuition, then it's going to be hard. Okay, and that's exactly parallel to in order to know anything by observation, you first have to know that observation is
Mm.
like first you have to prove that the five senses are reliable in order to use the five senses. Okay, which is what skeptics think in epistemology. Okay, but as is well known, if you accept that, then you're screwed. Is you cannot refute the skeptics starting from nothing, right? Like if you accept that in order to use any cognitive faculty, you have to first prove that's reliable, then obviously you can't do anything.
Right.
You're not going to construct the proof if you can't use your cognitive faculties. So,
Right. And I mean, at the same time, it can be maybe this is I don't know if you were going with this, but question begging to where I'm to try to prove how do you prove math without using math or something like that.
yeah, I mean, so like, I decided to go to the vision doctor to see if my eyes are reliable. Right?
Mhm.
But then the skeptic says, "Oh, but how did you know that the doctor actually existed?" Because I saw him or whatever. Okay. But it's like that with everything, right? So how do I find out if my memory is reliable? Okay, I'm going to do some test of my memory, right? You say like, okay, I think I know where I left this book, and then I'm going to go and see if the book is there, right?
Mhm.
Okay, but then by the time I go and find the book, I'm relying on my memory that I remembered. Right? I'm remembering that I remembered that the book was there,
Mhm.
and that
Yeah.
and then I see that it's actually there. And then, then I have to collect multiple instances of this where my memory was correct. So I have to rely on my memory to do that. So, I'm screwed there. And then, if I want to find out whether reasoning is reliable, okay, I got to construct an argument that reasoning is reliable. Oh, I'm going to be reasoning there. So
Mhm.
I'm not allowed to do that. Right?
Yeah.
And so, like, with all of the cognitive faculties, you have the same problem. Like, you can't verify that it's reliable without using it.
Right. And so I guess it would lead someone to this kind of global skepticism, but even the skeptic pretty couldn't even rely on its. I mean, so I'm thinking of this global skepticist who might say, well, we can't rely on anything in this sense to where I mean, can they even rely on their own kind of cognitive faculties if they're coming to those conclusions? So it seems like that would be self defeating to where they can't even believe their own conclusion about something.
No, that's right. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, if you hold this view, then nothing is justified, including that statement, right? And then you just arrived at that. So, oh, so I have to reject that. But wait, I just rejected that on the basis of an argument which I'm not allowed to accept. So now,
Yeah.
like what?
Where are you at? Yeah,
Can't
exactly.
do
So
anything.
yeah, so it makes sense to then start. You're saying in the starting point is to where the intuitionist has this grounding to where it's like, well, we kind of have a prima facie justification, on what actually appears to be the case.
Yeah.
Um,
Right. So, I mean, the way that you avoid skepticism is, well, I assume that things are the way they seem unless I have reason for doubting that, right?
yeah.
Like if you start out with, I assume nothing until it's proven, then you're screwed. Now, but if you start out with, I assume it's the way it seems unless I have reason to doubt it, then the skeptic is going to lose, right? They don't have adequate reason for doubting it. And then you go, okay, so if you're allowed to use intuition itself, then you can conclude that intuition is reliable.
Okay.
Like, how do you do that? Well, it coheres, right?
Hmm.
Like, I have intuitions that fit with each other,
Okay.
so they're probably reliable. if I get to start by assuming intuition until I have a reason to doubt it.
Okay, so to kind of parse a little bit of what we're saying a little bit. So intuition, kind of at its grounding, is a non-natural meta ethic, as opposed to a kind of natural, I guess, meta ethic with naturalism, reductionism, and syntheticism. I think that's what the two distinct, like the two kind of different branches of outside of.
Yeah, I mean, so the word naturalism is used in a couple of different ways in philosophy, right? So sometimes people use this to basically mean empiricism or something like all of our knowledge comes from observation,
Mhm.
and sometimes they use it to mean something in the neighborhood of everything is physical or everything is this sort of stuff that is studied by the natural sciences. Um, so there are some realists who are naturalists. That
Yeah.
is, they think that there are moral properties, but that these moral properties can be explained in terms of like non-moral properties. Like you can give a scientific theory of what goodness is, and goodness is really, fill it in with some like, description of um, some description that doesn't have to use the word good or other moral terms.
Okay, so like a kind of an analogy would be like water, right? So something with water, and but the natural property of water is H2O. The two, so what good? So and good would be what water is, and then equals to H2O. But whatever that natural properties would be for good,
Yeah,
right? Something like that. Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So, like there are correct reductionist theories, right, where you explain what something is without using that word or any synonym of it. And, water is H2O is an example of that, right? Notice like there's a compound where, each of the molecules has three atoms, including two hydrogen and one oxygen atom. And so notice that that explanation explains what it is and doesn't use the word water or anything that's equivalent to that. Yeah.
Okay.
So like maybe there's an explanation of good that's like that. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, it happens that nobody is given like a plausible candidate for what that is. You might have something like, oh, maybe goodness is like producing more pleasure. Like an action is good or a state of affairs is good if it causes more pleasure in the
Hmm.
universe. Okay. Right. So, like, I don't think that's um, especially plausible, right? But that's the kind of thing that somebody might say, right?
And so when you say that it's not plausible, is it that it just because it leads to, I guess, absurd kind of conclusions, or is it just kind of not plausible in the sense that it just like analytically it's circular or something like that?
Yeah, it's not circular. I mean, like unless you think maybe pleasure is explained in terms of good, right? Maybe pleasure means good feeling,
Yeah.
right? But let's assume that's not. Um, yeah, no, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's true, right? So, there are counterexamples. Like there's a story about the experience machine where
Hmm.
like you get plugged into a machine and you're just like you just have electrodes stuck into your head and it's just like stimulating your brain, and then you're in the real world you're just lying in a bed for the rest of your life until you die, right?
Hmm.
But it's stimulating your brain to have pleasurable experiences for the rest of your life. Okay,
Hmm.
and assume that you have a choice. You can be like plugged into that machine for the rest of your life, or you can live a normal life.
Hmm.
And most people think the normal life is better, right?
Hmm.
Even though the being attached to the machine gives you more pleasure.
Yeah, I remember this that kind of this thought experiment in my intro class to where you can experience, I guess, like someone like a heroin addict who's just constantly getting high, and that's a, I guess, quantifiably pleasurable because that they're consistently getting high. But is that a life kind of worth living, um, as opposed to kind of a normal life to where you experience some hardships, but at the same time your quality of life. I think that's where. So I'm not sure where necessarily I fall in all this, but it seems as if like to push back a little bit on this. It seems as if the naturalist could make a move, at least the move that I think I would make would be it's not so much like the quantitative pleasure, but it's more of the qualitative pleasure, where it's the quality of pleasure that we get from, hanging. Like for example, me spending time with my daughter, that is qualitatively better than getting high, on heroin or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I don't myself believe this. Like, I don't know what's meant by qualities of pleasure or
Mhm.
whatever.
Okay.
But some people think that. Okay, but you can get whatever you think is the highest quality pleasure, you can
Yeah.
put into the experience machine, right?
Hmm.
So like, your brain will get stimulated to have the experience of spending time with your virtual daughter who is not a real person, but
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
will be tricked into thinking that it's a real person when you're in the machine. And so then you'll experience a pleasure that's qualitatively like the one that you have in real life. Okay. And then, after you plug into the machine, of course, your real daughter will have no father and will, uh,
Yeah.
will become an orphan, and,
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
is good for her. But you will have forgotten this because this is how the machine works.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good pushback. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure necessarily. So this is something like I haven't really thought too much about. It was just something like it just I guess appears that there's a I don't know if you can you can't necessarily quantify the phenomenological experience of like of a pleasure, I guess, in that way, where it just appears to be the case that the quality of life is better, um, whether it can be articulated. Um,
Yeah. Well, it appears that the life is better, right?
mhm.
Is it more pleasurable? Right.
Okay.
That's a distinct question.
Yeah.
No, being on heroin all the time is more pleasurable.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. Okay. No, I agree. So then I guess so in this sense, a move that reduction. So that what we're talking about is naturalism, like that's reductionist, as opposed to kind of a naturalist who's a non-reductionist, which would be, I guess, would intuition fall under that, or is it would be like more of a synthetic kind of, um,
I mean, I don't know what non-reductive naturalism is.
okay.
I sometimes hear people say that, but I don't know what they mean. So, um, but like in metaethics,
Hmm.
naturalism is a form of reductionism.
Hmm.
So reductionism is the idea that you could explain what good is, or take some other moral term. You could explain what that thing refers to using other terms without having to use moral language.
Okay.
And there are two varieties of this. There's a realist and an anti-realist variety. The anti-realist variety is subjectivism, right? That is, the facts about value are just facts about our attitudes. And so, like being wrong is just being disapproved of by people or something. And then the realist, that is naturalist version, is well, it's just anything other than according to our attitudes.
Okay.
Goodness is reducible to something, but not our attitudes.
Yeah. And it always seems so. It there seems to be a camp of non-theists that want to say, okay, well, um, maybe it's just their philosophical assumptions about the natural world, but it seems as if they fall on the lines of some form of subjectivism or non-cognitivism, to where it's like they feel that it's just like it is just my mental attitude. It is just kind of, and they kind of like some type of anti-realist constructivist would say like, well, yeah, like we make up our own morality without, like morality and ethics relates to human beings. If you were to remove human beings from this world, um, morality and ethics would cease to exist. And as a result of them ceasing to exist, it's contingent upon us. And if it's contingent upon us, then it's based off of what we think it is. That seems to kind of a loose, like, kind of inference of how they come to the conclusion where it's like we make up morality because we care about morality, we value morality,
Yeah.
um, and so
I mean,
yeah.
well, I mean, like there might be a confusion in there, right? So, suppose that all of the people in the world disappeared, then all of the facts of anthropology would be gone, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there'd be no anthropological truths. Well, okay, maybe there would be like historical ones because there's still fossils. Okay, so but imagine that all the remains also get destroyed and all of the remains of our artifacts are destroyed. Then there are no more anthropological truths, right? I guess. Does that mean that anthropology is subjective?
Right, and
So
I think most people would
no,
have
right?
yeah, appearance would be no, it's not, yeah.
That's right. Like, which shows that's a completely different issue, right?
Mhm.
Um, what subjective means is something like, well, it's constituted by our attitudes towards the thing that we're talking about. Right? So, like, saying goodness is subjective is saying a thing is made good by our taking a certain attitude towards it.
Mhm.
Like, we like it or we approve it or whatever. Okay.
Mhm.
That's different from whether things will continue to be good after
Hmm.
after you're dead. Right?
Okay.
And like, and how could it, how could these come apart? Well, suppose you thought the only thing that's good is pleasurable experiences,
Hmm.
which I don't think, but some people think. Okay.
Hmm.
Then, if all conscious beings disappear, there won't be any good anymore because there won't be any more pleasure. Right?
Yeah.
But it's not a subjectivist view, right? Like these people think pleasure is objectively good.
Hmm.
Pleasure is good whether or not you think it's good.
Hmm.
Even if you disapprove of pleasure, it's still good, whatever. So
Yeah.
it's objective, right? But it would be dependent on conscious beings. Not necessarily humans, of course, but
Yeah.
it could be other conscious beings.
And it doesn't seem like that's necessarily a problem like for an objectivist. Because the way I look at it, when I've listened to kind of this critique of objectivism before, it seems like, okay, well, just because something's contingent upon another thing, right? So I mean, you think of like the sun, right? The sun is contingent upon certain molecules forming, and then you can kind of get like the hydrogen and everything. I'm not a chemist, so I don't know what's really going on with the sun, but it's contingent upon certain facts of the matter that had to pre-exist before the sun actually was formed. And so, well, just because it's contingent, it doesn't seem to follow that it's therefore like there's this subjective attitude towards, or it's not just subjective, I guess, in that sense.
I
Or
mean, it depends on what the thing is dependent upon, right?
mhm,
And so you're like, wow, lots of things are dependent on other things. Like almost everything in the universe is dependent on something.
mhm,
But it's perfectly real, right?
mhm,
Okay, but then there's a thought, well, but what if it's dependent on us? Okay, well, I don't know, like, so this thing, this, coffee glass mug, whatever it is,
mhm,
was created by people, so it's dependent on people. So it's subjective? No, it's not subjective. It's physical. It's a real physical object.
yeah,
Okay, so then you have to go to, well, it's dependent on our attitude or something.
yeah.
There's a more specific thing, which is it's constitutively dependent on attitudes. Like what makes the fact true is our having a certain attitude.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
And so I guess there's two lines that popped into my head as we're going with this. So the objectivist wants to say, or the intuitionist would say that when I perceive some type of moral either situation intellectually, like as a thought experiment, or actually like I'm experiencing, I see something um, like a child that gets abused or something. So if I see a child and they're getting abused by the parents, I am seeing something of that action has a property of badness to it. And so that the objectivist would say something like that, I think, right? But there's a certain property that is going on within that action, regardless of whether what I think about it. The case, kind of in the same way that grass can have the property of wetness, when there's water on it. Like there's no, it's not on my observing it. It's just that's the fact of the matter, and I am observing it at this point to where the subjectivist would say, well, the only reason why that's bad is because I think it's bad of what's happening. I'm not seeing a property, right? Is that something on the lines? Like, okay,
Yeah. I mean, and the way that you stated it just now, it's a circular theory, right? Like it's bad because I think it's bad.
hmm,
Notice that the word bad appeared in the explanation of what bad means,
hmm,
right? So, like if that was true, then when you think that it's bad, what you're thinking is actually just that you think it's bad.
yeah,
So, right? So you get like bad equals I think it's bad. That means bad equals I think it's bad, and then it just goes on. Right?
yeah,
Anyway, um, more sophisticated subjectivists wouldn't say think.
okay,
They would say like you have a certain emotional attitude, like
hmm,
bad equals I have a negative emotional reaction,
hmm,
or I feel disapproval. Where disapproval is just an emotion, right? So it's not, um, it's not representing a property.
okay. And it seems as if at least the subjectivist might say too. Well, it makes sense. So I think there's different arguments that are getting that would be railed against intuitionism in the sense of like evolutionary ethics, saying, well, of course I have an aversion to um, a child being, abused, right? Because we're social beings, and there's kin selection, and there's reciprocal altruism. Anyway, they can give an evolutionary account of why we kind of have this psychological aversion to this an action like that.
Yeah.
Does that, and I guess they would say that it would try that undermines kind of the objectivity, but you would say it actually really doesn't because it doesn't, um, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? Go ahead. You can explain why you would
I
kind
mean,
of.
like the first reaction you should have is, oh wait, like all of my cognitive faculties evolved by natural selection.
Hmm.
Does that mean everything I perceive is subjective, right? Like, okay, my vision evolved by natural selection, and the only reason I believe in the cup is that I see it, and also feel it, but that also evolved. So doesn't mean I shouldn't believe the cup is real. So no, right? Um, but I mean, there's like more argument to be given, right? What the evolutionary psychologists would say, or what the skeptics would say, is, yeah, but your perception of the physical world is different because misperceiving the physical world causes you to not survive and reproduce as effectively as if you perceive it correctly.
Hmm.
But misperceiving the moral facts, like you can still survive and reproduce really well if you misperceive the moral.
Right.
Of course, that depends on what the moral facts are, right?
Okay.
Like if the moral facts include that surviving and reproducing is good, then
Hmm.
you don't want to misperceive them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, um, okay, and I think that they have an argument um, if you can predict details of our moral intuitions, like fairly specific details, by appealing to evolution and things that you wouldn't otherwise expect. Okay. But what I think is actually the case is um, like the whole paradigm is so loose that you can explain almost anything. And the moral intuitions that we actually have are not what you would naturally have expected. It's not that like you can't come up with a story,
Hmm.
right? Okay, but what you would naturally expect if you follow most of what goes on in like discussion of evolutionary psychology, what you would expect is, okay, people are selfish.
Hmm.
The whole thing is about how it's
Hmm.
kind of about that.
Hmm.
It's kind of about how you care about your own survival and reproduction. So what you would expect is that our moral intuition should be selfishness is good. Like we should all be intuitive, ethical egoists.
Hmm.
That's basically the opposite of the truth. Now
Hmm.
you could come up with a story for why, something other than egoism could be advantageous. But then it's the sort of story that you could give almost no matter what.
Yeah. 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 It seems like, yeah. No, I agree. Um, and so I guess it goes into, at least what also goes into my mind a little bit is, for at least, I guess, one more pull from a subjectivist might say, well, okay, let's say that is a moral thing. Like, why do I care about it? Or why should I value that? Um, and so, where I find I think I used to find that that question kind of troubling too. It's like, okay, well, how can you ever convince someone to value a proposition without or value something? Um,
Yeah.
and so that
Um,
seems like that's also kind of a play within subjectivism, at least
yeah.
specifically, where it's like, well, why, I'm not going to do anything because I don't care to do it. And it's like this Humean, I think you talk about it a little bit in your book too, this kind of Humean notion that, I mean, I'm always acting with, maybe this isn't as careful language, but I act in accordance with my desires. And so if I don't desire something, if I don't desire to do good, then or if I don't desire to be a good father, there's nothing that someone could ever argue about why I should be a good father or something like that.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of true of everything, right? So,
Hmm.
I mean, anything that you say, there you can imagine a person who refuses to accept it and who cannot be convinced of it. So what, right?
Yeah.
So, if let's say you meet a dogmatic colorblind person, right?
Okay.
And by that, I mean, not only does he not see colors, but he refuses to accept that they exist. It's
Yeah.
like,
Okay.
you can imagine a person who will just not accept any premise that would lead to color being real.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, okay, too bad.
But what? Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, there may be people who are like that about morality, right?
Mhm.
We call them psychopaths.
Yeah.
And yeah, they just don't get it. It might be that you can't explain it to them.
Hmm. Do you think that also? Okay, for one, it seems as if it assumes kind of like everything has to, for motivation, it has to come from internal, what's going on internally. Whether it seems that there are cases at least that I can do something because of external reasons that are outside of me.
Yeah.
So
But
it's go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, so what you raised a minute ago was the Humean theory of reasons, the theory that you only have a reason to do something if you have a desire.
Mm-hmm.
Then, like you desire something, then you believe that a certain action will make the thing more likely to happen. Then you have a reason to do the action. Um, and, a reason and a motive to do the action. Is it possible to have a different kind of reason? I should think so. Like, so what if you think that an action is morally obligatory? Yeah, that seems to me like that's a reason to do it,
Mm-hmm.
even if you don't want to do it.
Right.
It's a reason. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying that guarantees that you do it. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
saying that's a reason to do it.
Yeah. Um, okay. And it seems as if there's I don't know if you come across this too, but there's always this little bit of a double standard when it comes to morality, a little bit. But there's certain epistemic values that we also have. Um, like when we're coming up with a model that don't seem to be rejected, at least within the sciences, it seems to be the case too, where there are certain. So, for example, I think like Hillary Putnam has a book, The Fact Value Dichotomy, where he talks about that there are these epistemic values, that there's a double standard between, like, they're just values, right, that we have, but yet we don't hold it to the same standard as such as a value of being good or being right or bad or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, so like this is one of the um, recently popular forms of argument for moral realists. Okay, most people who are skeptical about moral values are not skeptical about all values.
Right.
Like they believe in the value of rational inquiry or something like that,
Hmm.
because they fancy themselves to be doing that, right?
Hmm.
And the value of seeking the truth and whatever. Um, okay, you have like normative judgments about what's epistemically justified, like what's a justified belief. Um, and one point, this is something that Terence Q. Mayo makes a big deal about, is the arguments against moral values being real would also apply to these other values, right? Like if you say, oh, well, it's not part of the scientific worldview, whatever, and it's like it's not physical. There's no way to know about it other than by intuition or something like that. Okay, so that's all true about the epistemic.
Hmm.
Like why you have to only form justified beliefs,
Hmm.
why you should base beliefs on evidence and stuff like that, why you should
Yeah.
care about the truth.
Yeah.
Right,
No.
and then like another argument from my former student Spencer Case is many of the epistemic judgments that you make would actually depend upon moral judgments, right? So, and this is more subtle, but so like a person has an unjustified belief if they didn't do enough investigation before forming the belief, right?
Okay.
Okay, but what counts as enough investigation can also depend upon moral judgments, right? So like, what if in order to do further investigation, I would have to have killed 3 people? Right?
Okay.
In that case, I shouldn't have done more investigation, right?
Hmm.
So then it's perfectly responsible that I formed a conclusion without collecting that extra evidence, right?
Yeah.
But if I didn't have to do anything wrong or imprudent or whatever to collect more evidence, then I might have been epistemically obligated, and then I might have an irrational belief if I didn't collect the evidence. Right?
Okay. That's interesting too, because yeah, this whole epistemic values, I don't think it gets enough credit, or at least it gets taken for granted a little bit, um, within at least the scientific community, at least within what I've read in in the literature.
Yeah.
Um, and so I guess it goes into at least something that I kind of want to move on to a little bit, is that I think, at least for myself, it seems as if it's like, okay, well, what are we? Okay, is like the moral property we are intuitively perceiving, when we see it, when we're observing it, and when we're intellectually thinking about it. Does that property? I think a lot of people that are naturalists or non-theistic will say, like, okay, well, where does it exist? Like, what is that property, right? Just like the property of water and wet, like a grass can have wetness as the property, but that's still existing in the physical world. Where would the moral property be? Is it somewhere in this kind of like like in the Platonic realm, or is it just where is it? And so
Is it
yeah.
in the Platonic heaven, as they
Yeah.
say?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wherever numbers are,
Yeah.
which is to say, not anywhere. Right?
Yeah.
Not everything is spatial. So like physical objects are spatial. They have locations and sizes and shapes and so on. And then there are more abstract things that are not spatial. Right? So,
Yeah.
like the number four, how big is it? I mean, like,
Yeah.
what shape is it? And like, where is it located? Is it over here, whatever? It
Hmm.
doesn't have a location. Yeah, goodness doesn't have a location either, right? By the way, like this is true of basically all properties, okay? So
Okay.
even spatial properties, right? So property of squareness, where's that? Well, okay, this property of squareness doesn't have a location,
Hmm.
right? It's not like it is a shape, but it doesn't itself have another shape. And the spatial properties don't themselves have spatial properties.
Yeah. But yep, it's somehow, for lack of a better word, like transcendent, right? It's both into it's an abstract thought, or and can actually be physical, because you can actually have a physical square, but you can actually conceptualize a square in your mind as well. That's, I guess,
Yeah,
immaterial.
yeah, so a square physical object has a location,
Hmm.
but squareness as such doesn't have a location, just like
Yeah.
the abstract property squareness, right?
So I'm trying to think, kind of fleshing out a little bit more of your theory. When I'm perceiving something or intuiting goodness, it's equivalent to like squareness or math, something like that, right? Is that something you would agree with, right?
Uh,
Or
I mean, it's a property like how those things are properties,
okay,
and it doesn't have a location like the way those things don't have locations.
okay,
Right? Like, by the way, like we intuit things about all these other properties too. So, like, I intuit that four is more than three.
hmm,
So I just think about them. I understand what four is. I understand what three is, and then I see that that judgment is true.
okay. Based off of like, I mean, you can literally count objects and be like, okay, well, this is more than that, and then is that where you're like kind of where we're
Well, I
or
mean, I could have two groups of objects in front of me, but I don't have to have any actual objects in front of me. If
right?
I just understand what four is, then I
Mhm.
just understand that it's more than three.
Okay. So then, okay, so my question kind of goes into, so if I'm perceiving or intuiting goodness, so how does, okay, I guess there's two questions that I have. Maybe this does, so maybe I don't know if this will make sense. So fairness is good. Is there the property of goodness, like conferring onto fairness in that way, or is it just kind of like fairness is just good? It's just another property of good. Is that, I don't know if that makes sense.
Um, well, so these moral properties are what they call second order properties or something like that. That is, when the ordinary objects that you see in the world, when they're good or bad in virtue of their other characteristics, their non-moral characteristics. So, like there's an act where somebody tortured a baby for fun,
Hmm.
and the action was wrong because torturing babies for fun is a wrong-making property. Right?
Okay.
It's like the fundamental thing is like the fundamental moral truth is this relationship between the descriptive property and the moral property, like that having this descriptive property, like that makes the thing wrong. But so it's like the moral property is different from ordinary properties because you can't just have the moral property. And you can't like change the moral property without changing the other properties.
Okay.
So you could have like, say you have like a red circle,
Uh-huh.
you could change the color without changing the other property. It could become a
Okay.
green circle
Okay.
because the redness, is not like it's just a normal property.
Okay.
But you can't if you have a wrong action, you can't change the wrongness and then have the other properties.
You
Like
can't. Okay.
right, so like there's this wrong act of torturing the baby. You can't imagine a different act that's right, but is also torturing the baby.
Okay.
Like
Okay.
it has the same descriptive properties, but is instead right.
Okay.
And, okay, and so like that's why I'm saying the moral property is second order, right? Because it depends
Okay.
upon the other properties.
So, and then I guess this kind of goes into like what they, I guess, is this like the supervenience problem? Like, how does that second order moral property supervene upon like the descriptive natural properties that are occurring within um, an action?
Yeah, yeah. This feature of being determined by the non-moral properties is referred to as supervenience. And some philosophers think that it's a problem that moral properties supervene on descriptive
Mhm.
properties. but I basically have no idea how this is a problem.
Mhm.
This just seems true. I don't know. I don't know why that would be a problem.
Okay. And I know you have some kind of general. I think you had in your book there's something with the same thing. I guess can apply to logic and certain things, um, where there's a supervenience upon that, but no one seem to think of like that's a problem or something like that.
Like in the logic example, you have these logical properties like an argument is valid or invalid,
Hmm.
and that supervenes on stuff like the form of the argument, like the structure of the argument. And nobody goes, "Oh my God, there's supervenience. That's so puzzling and weird." And like, we must conclude that validity is subjective or something like that. It's just
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No one seems to be doing that as the case. Okay. All right. Well,
okay.
we're coming up to the hour. Being kind of closing remarks. I don't want to take up too much more of your time.
I don't know. Buy my book and look
Yeah,
up my other books too. That's my main thought, the main takeaway here.
perfect.
Buy
And is
my
there a
book.
place that where people can find you if they, want to contact you or just kind of? I think you do have a website.
Yeah, people should go to my blog. Actually, it's called fakenews.net. fakenous.net.
Okay. And that concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. See you next time.